Ross stiffened, keeping his hands out at his side, and the person with the gun, a young Caucasian man, pushed him back against the wall, then took his bag and service weapon from his hand. The young man didn't seem to be the most familiar with firearms, because it took him a second to realize that he hadn't pulled the hammer on the pistol back yet, and he hastily corrected that as more people appeared from behind him out of the gloom. Each held a weapon of some kind, but Ross only saw one other gun, another pistol. Everyone else in the group held makeshift weapons, mostly consisting of cuts of metal pipe. The dimly illuminated room itself felt like a big space, and was likely a storage facility of some sort. The young man holding the gun in Ross's face seemed to be the youngest of the group. He looked to be around a decade younger than the officer, likely in his mid-20s. The second person Ross saw was a woman, the only one in the group, and she was closer to his own age. Behind her was a large, well-built Latino man, wearing dark clothes, who Ross hadn't noticed in the gloom of the room at first. The man was so well-built and muscular that Ross would have bet in a scenario where he was given something like a metal rod, or just the pipe he was holding, and told to fight one of the raptors outside in a one-on-one fight, the big man would probably be able to win. The other people in the group, there were 6 in total, were a mix of ages, but all also Caucasian, save for one additional Latino man, who was much less muscularly built and younger looking than the first. He looked to be around the same age as the young man who was pointing the gun at Ross. No one in the group appeared to be younger, and no one in the group appeared to be older than maybe their mid-40s. One individual near the back of the group seemed to have some authority, because he stood with his arms crossed until Ross's bags were handed to him, and then he stood in silence and watched the newcomer. He was a well-built man, with black hair, and appeared to be around 30, and was slightly taller than the officer he was glaring at. The young man pointing the pistol at Ross's face didn't remove the gun or look away from him, but started talking over his shoulder to the others in the group as they began discussing Ross. "Why the hell did you open that door? They almost got inside. If that guy had been a second later on closing it, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Unless it was from inside their stomachs," the man who seemed to be the leader shouted. The young man looked at him over his shoulder. "I opened the door because them catching him out in the street wouldn't have changed our situation. But in here, maybe we can use him," he explained. Ross started to open his mouth, but the young man shoved the gun barrel practically inside his mouth. "Shut up," he said. "Use him how?" the girl asked. "Easy. Toss him to the raptors. Maybe out the door that leads to the alley on the other side of the street, and then we can make a break for the trucks and get out of here. That would put the raptors on another street, so we'd have a few seconds." The young man looked at the others and continued. "Look, we don't know this guy from Adam. We owe him nothing. Our group, our people, and getting back to them matters more than a guy who just drove into town on a scooter. He could be anyone for all we know." The group seemed to consider it, each making eye contact and sharing a silent, contemplative look. "I think it's clear at this point they're not going away. They've been circling the building and trying to find a way inside since they chased us in here yesterday. We're lucky they haven't realized this building is connected to that store on the opposite street, or they'd be able to easily come at us by busting out the front windows," the woman eventually said. "She's not wrong," one of the other members of the group said, a young man with blonde hair. "Those things are some of those talking ones, too. They're smart enough to know we can't get out of here. They'll starve us out if we don't do something, or if they don't find a way in." The big Latino man nodded and smacked the metal pipe he was holding in his palm lightly, as if he was ready to whack the stranger over the head with it and toss him out onto the street. "Hey," Ross started, but he was cut off again. "I told you to shut up," the young man said, "and keep your hands up by your head." "Okay," Ross complied, "but just hear me out for a second. If you're really thinking about feeding me to those things, then the polite thing to do is at least let me talk first." "We don't owe you anything, officer," the big Latino man said. "Just hear me out for a second," Ross protested, managing to speak despite having a pistol basically shoved into his mouth. "All right," the leader said, raising a hand and taking a few steps forward. The blond man glared now, crossing his arms, and he went silent, sulking and looking like he'd already made up his mind on what to do. The leader, who seemed to be wanting to hear all options before making his choice, stepped forward, and Ross could make out some of the details about him. His gray shirt was sweat-stained. He was built heavier and sporting a light stubble on his face, and he had a no-nonsense look on his face so well-defined that Ross wondered what this guy had already done to get by in the apocalypse. Despite looking like he'd be willing to throw a stranger to hungry dinosaurs himself, he also didn't give off the aura of a bad person, which was something Ross knew how to recognize from his years as a cop. Instead, he saw the man was willing to give him a fair chance. You tell us what's better than just tossing you out the back door, making a run for our trucks after they go after you, outrunning the dinosaurs while they eat you, and getting back to our group all alive and well, the leader said. Ross steadied his nerves and spoke. Look, I can't promise not doing that will give you a better result, but what if we try something else that has the same outcome for you either way? The man looked intrigued, so Ross continued. Something where you get back to your group either way, and I'll still be the one in danger, not you. But this way also gives me a fair fighting chance. Let me try to get you all out of here. You said you've been stuck here all day? Well, sometimes you just need a fresh perspective to see a way out. If I can, then we all get away. If not, you can do it your way. I won't fight you over it. The leader mulled Ross's words over and slowly nodded. All right. We'll give you a fair chance to find a way for all of us to get out of here. But if you can't figure something out, we'll throw you to the wolves. If you do come up with something, great. Heck, we'll even let you join us if it works, he said with a snort. This time, Ross slowly nodded. Deal, he agreed. Either way, you win in this. Okay. Remember, if it comes to it, you get fed to the dinosaurs first, and we make a run for it, the leader said, patting the young man on the shoulder. Lower the gun, pal. Let's see what the good officer here can figure out. Come on, cop. We're going up to the roof. With the condition of being fed to the dinosaurs, if he couldn't find a way to get the group out of their tight spot hanging over his head, Ross maintained his calm, on-duty attitude as he stepped out onto the roof. Thanks to his police training, he didn't panic quickly in a high-tense situation, but even still, he had never been in such an instance where the threat to his life was so high from so many points. Emerging from the door of the stairwell that led up to the roof, Ross followed the group's leader to the edge and looked down at the street below. His hand went instinctively to his holster when he saw what was waiting on the street below, but it was empty. It had momentarily slipped his mind that the group had taken all of his supplies from him. Circling below was a chilling sight. The large, feather-covered forms of the dinosaurs were waiting down on the street, their gazes looking up at the people on the roof. Though they were 2 stories above the ground, Ross swore he could see the gleams in the dinosaurs' glaring eyes. At first, they'd been mingling about. Then one had looked up, spoke, and the others all did the same, coming together and stopping right below the group. They looked like menacing dark shapes as they stood well within the building's now long shadow. Faint sounds of chittering echoed up from the street below as the dinosaurs squawked at each other. They seemed to have no issues going back and forth from speech to squawks or other vocalizations. Though no one on the roof could hear it, the dinosaurs were indeed speaking. With her teeth bared, the pack's alpha glared up at the silhouetted shape of Ross on the roof above her, able to make him out since he was the only one wearing a hat. That new one is mine. You can have the others. I don't care how you divide them up. But I want him all to myself, she said, audibly tapping one of her sickle claws on the asphalt in agitation. I'll cut his eyes out, too. As a start! She snarled with venom in her voice, rage simmering from one of her packmates being shot and killed. Some of the feathers on her head and neck rose in agitation as she spoke, never looking away from the stranger who had killed one of her own. She continued looking up at the deputy for several minutes, her gaze focused and eyes unblinking. She parted her jaws. I want him. He is mine, she thought, finger claws flexing and sickle claws tapping on the ground. She was having sadistically lustful thoughts about everything she would do to the new person once she caught him. He would regret interfering with their hunt and then killing one of their own. They hadn't been planning on killing him at first. Instead, they were planning to scare him away so the people inside the building wouldn't have a chance to get the weapons Ross had been carrying. That had changed when he'd opened fire, and now the Alpha was only seeing red. This wasn't part of the hunt. This was simply vengeance and reckoning. Stepping forward, still looking up at the people on the roof, the Alpha Raptor squawked. The others all did the same in unison and turned their collective gazes back up to the people on the roof as well. The effect of their chorus was a single, magnified, squawking bark which echoed down the streets. Looking down at the street, Ross didn't like what he saw and glanced to each side. The others were standing on each side of him, also looking down at the street with grim or unreadable expressions on their faces. Ross adjusted his hat. "What are your names?" he asked. "You don't need to worry about that right now. You might not know us much longer if you don't come up with anything soon," the leader replied, not looking at him, but instead down at the street. "Hey, I'm a cop. I protect and serve people. I still want to despite all this. I'd like a little decency in return, at least," Ross said, looking back down at the street. "How'd you get trapped up here anyway?" "We're part of a group of 14, someone else answered, the young man Ross had first interacted with. He looked away from the dinosaurs and over at Ross before continuing. "About half of us came here on a supply run, the other half stayed back at camp. We were coming here to this building when those things came out of nowhere. They ambushed us from an alley while we were on the street, trying to get that door I opened for you unchained. We just got inside and locked the door, and we've been here since." "That's been a day ago now," the young man said. Ross nodded slightly after a moment. "Some of the carnivores seem to have adapted well to hunting in urban areas like this. My town had a few show up throughout the winter," he said, before walking away from the edge and over to the other side of the building, and looking down at the street he'd first seen the raptors on. The young man followed him, and Ross gazed down at the gory scene he'd seen on the street. "Who'd the motorcycle belong to? It's not parked with the rest of your vehicles," Ross asked. "One member of our group. He just parked around the corner," the young man said. "Yeah, it's the guy they were eating. A little while ago, he tried to sneak out of the side door, back down onto the street, and through that alley down there. He was going to get on the bike and try to lead the raptors away so we could get to the trucks. He made too much noise on opening that chain-link door at the end of the alley, and they were all over him in seconds." He pointed to the spot. A side door of the building opened into an alley, and at the end of the alley was a chain fence, much taller than a person, with a chain-link door which could be opened to allow access to the street. The door was open now, and the mutilated, eaten corpse was not far from it, close to the motorcycle. Ross wondered if the man had tried to run back to the alley when he was attacked. "They made a show of it," the young man spoke again, "when they caught him. They made a show of making sure that we saw everything they did to him. They ate the non-vital parts first. They went layer by layer of skin, and at one They only killed him once everything they could eat that wouldn't kill him was eaten. At one point, they even gouged his eyes out and tried to make him guess what part was next now that he couldn't see what they were doing. One of them, the one who seems to be the alpha, kept giving him 3 guesses before she'd do whatever she was thinking. If he guessed right, she didn't cut that part of him right away. They'd just move on to the next. It was the most sadistic thing I've ever seen. I guess after a while, she got sick of it because she and the others just started eating him alive. She kept looking back up here to make sure we were still watching. Thankfully, we locked that side door again before they could think to try opening it. Ross didn't respond for a moment before he turned to look at the young stranger. So the motorcycle is down there, and the rest of your vehicles... 2 trucks, the young man said. Yeah, 2 trucks. Are around the corner? Right across the street from that door I opened for you. So, good distance between them, Ross mumbled, looking thoughtful. He bit his lip, thoughtful, as a crazy idea began formulating in his mind. Having had enough, the leader came over. Well, you coming up with something? He asked, the rest of the group following. Ross slowly nodded. Yeah, starting to, he replied. The raptors on the street are by your trucks right now. They're nowhere close to the motorcycle or even in view of it. The leader glanced over the edge at the motorcycle on the street below. So, your point? Look, your guy tried to slip out of the alley to it to draw them off, but he made too much noise opening that gate down there. But it's open now. And since the bike is right outside of it, and around the corner from the raptors, I want to try the same thing, Ross said. I'll get on the bike, make a whole lot of noise, and draw them off. When they chase me, you can make a run for the vehicles, and everyone gets a fighting chance. You can see how well that idea worked before, the leader replied. The gate is open now. I can squeeze past it without bumping it. And if I don't have to open it more, it won't make any noise, and I can slip onto the street unnoticed. The leader looked unconvinced and unimpressed, but the young man unexpectedly came to Ross's side and voiced his support. That could work, he said. Achillobators aren't like, say, Dakota raptors. They're fast, but they can't run at full speed for very long. If you can get onto that motorcycle and keep ahead of them long enough to tire them out, you can outrun them. Same thing on our end. We get to the trucks and we can outrun them easily given enough time. We can't go at full speed on the streets because of the debris, but once we're outside, it's all open road. Okay, fair point. But you're forgetting one important part, the leader conceded. To drive the bike, you need the key, and it's down there, he added, pointing at the corpse. He had the keys when he got eaten. You're gonna have to look through that mess to find the key and hope it's in there somewhere and also wasn't eaten. Ross nodded in acceptance. Won't be the first body I've handled lately. For the last few months, I was trying to catch a serial killer who used acid to melt his victims. It doesn't bother me much anymore. It'll be the first without gloves, though, he said, muttering the last part with a grimace. Well, again, you just better hope they didn't eat the key, too, the leader said. Of course, if they did, you should be able to still get it, considering the other part of our deal. I'm sure you'll join them quickly enough and find which raptor ate them. Ross didn't reply to that. He kept his face stony and didn't give a response. The leader turned to walk back to where he could see the raptors, and Ross turned when the young man patted his shoulder. Is he always like that? Ross asked. The young man shrugged. He just doesn't trust you. He responded with a shrug of his own, which then turned to a slightly grossed out look on his face. Your plan is really to go down there and hope you don't make a sound and search the body for the key? while also hoping it didn't get eaten as well. I also gotta lift up that bike, turn it on, and start driving it before they catch me, Ross replied, not looking like he liked the odds he had of pulling that idea off. I don't even know how to drive one of those things. I hope it's similar to that scooter I was driving. A lot of things had to go right that could easily go wrong in order for him to survive the next few minutes. He then looked back at the group's leader and called out, "Look, either way this goes, you'll have time to get away while they're distracted. But I will try to do this. I know the world is a mess right now, but helping people really is something I still want to do, and you guys look like you need it. I'll drive the raptors off on the bike. You just be ready to drive out of here, too." "And what are you gonna do when you drive away with them after you?" the man asked. Ross shook his head. "Try to outrun them. Maybe take out a few if I can," he said. "I just have to hope the key is in the corpse and not one of the raptors." The man still looked unconvinced, but he reached into his back pocket and pulled out Ross's service pistol, which he handed back to the deputy. "You're gonna need this then," he said. "We'll set you up with one of the rifles too." Ross nodded. "Make sure it's one of the ones with the strap," he said, checking the pistol, seeing it still had all the bullets left in the clip that he hadn't shot. Making sure one was still in the chamber, he then slid the weapon back into its holster. The leader took a rifle from Ross's bag and loaded it. "Look, here's some advice you should keep in mind. You're a cop, so I'm sure you saw your share of the bullshit these last few months. But this anomaly, or whatever you want to call it, that caused said bullshit, it spread around like a virus. And every virus has its variants. Each variant is different, and as you can see, not all the animals are quite as they should be. Likewise, some of those talking ones that showed up are more dangerous than others. Just be sure to expect the unexpected. I'm sure those on the street and others like them have more secrets hidden up their feathery hides than we know. And if you somehow survive, get out of the city before dark. You don't want to be in the city after dark." "Do I want to know the reason?" Ross asked. "No. If you don't get eaten down there, you'll sleep better tonight not knowing what comes out around here at night. We just need to be gone by nightfall," the leader replied, handing the rifle over. With Ross leading the way down, the group descended the stairs back into the large, dimly illuminated building. "What was this place?" Ross asked. "You said you were coming here, so you must know." The young man chuckled and simply replied, "The dungeon." "What?" Ross asked. The young man snorted, a slight smirk spread across his face. "Storage," he clarified. "The store I worked at, the one they kept mentioning, is attached to this building, and we kept all of our stock here. But there were no working lights, so we had to walk around back here with lanterns. So we called it the dungeon. I suggested we come here because I didn't think anyone else would know about it or think to check here. But the place was already cleaned out, so I was wrong. Probably my manager's doing." "So, what were you looking for?" Ross asked. The young man shook his head. "Food. There were totes upon totes of canned food and just add water meals. And whatever medical supplies or medicine we could find. Water, too. There were thousands of cases back here. It's all gone, though, so this was just a wasted effort." Before Ross could respond, the group's leader shoved his way between them, and his glare told Ross the conversation was over. "Talking time is over. It's time to get to it, officer. We gotta move before they try to break inside again." "He'll show you where the door to the alley is," the leader said, nodding to the young man. Ross nodded. "Right," he said. Just for future reference, you don't have to be a hard ass all the time to show people you're tough. You care about your people. Anyone can tell you mean business." That's enough to keep anyone who has common sense from wanting to mess with you. The leader snorted. I ain't a hard ass to my people, just outsiders. Just give it some thought, Ross replied, making sure the rifle was loaded and ready to be fired. Once he was satisfied, he slung it over his shoulder and nodded. The young man guided Ross to the side door that led out into the alley. They stopped outside of it, and Ross's guide sighed. Sorry about probably sending you to your death here. You seem like a nice guy. And the gun, too. Sorry about the gun to the face. Ross nodded and sighed as well. Well, if you hadn't opened the door, I probably would be dead already. At least now I got a fighting chance. He offered a small, friendly smile, and the two shook hands. Hey, if you do get through this, I think you'll fit in well and be useful. And don't worry about him. He'll back off if you pull this off. The young man then placed a hand on the doorknob. A little tip. You're gonna have to be quick. I hope you were an Olympic runner. Ross pointed to his badge. Sheriff's deputy, actually, he said. The young man shrugged. Well, I hope you weren't the donut-loving cop. I hope he was, the big Latino man suddenly said, who seemed to have followed the two but stayed hidden just in the gloom. More of him for the raptors to eat means the more time for us to make a run for the trucks. Thanks for that, Ross sarcastically replied, unslinging the rifle and holding it at the ready. The young man nodded to him. Save a bullet just for yourself. Just in case, he said, and slowly pulled the door open just enough for Ross to squeeze out past it. Golden sunlight streaked into the room like a beam of golden glowing yellow. As he prepared himself to step outside the door and, in all likelihood, all but right into the waiting jaws of the dinosaurs, Ross thought to himself that, no matter the outcome of what happened in the next few minutes, at least he'd be able to actually do something to help, protect, and serve people one more time. If he lived through this and got to join them, he'd be able to keep doing so, but if he died here in the city, he'd die knowing he'd do what he'd sworn to do one final time. And that a group of people who seemed like overall fine but scared and cautious folk would get going and get to have a second chance. With that in mind, Ross ducked down and slipped out through the door. He half crouched outside with the rifle ready, turning back once he heard the door be pushed closed again and locked. Taking a deep breath to calm his nerves, Ross stood and slowly walked down the alley, gun raised and keeping silent. The chain-link fence at the end of the alley drew nearer, and Ross had to put the rifle back over his shoulder to squeeze through the open gate. His badge brushed against it, and the fence made a soft jingle, but nothing more than it would have made in a soft gust of wind. It still made his heart skip a beat. Squeezing past without a problem, Ross stepped out onto the sidewalk and looked both ways. No raptors were in sight, and everything was still. In fact, a little too still for the deputy's liking. With the street clear, though, he stepped further away from the alley, but stopped before reaching the corpse. A further look around again confirmed no raptors were anywhere in sight. So, Ross crouched down by the body. It was a gory sight up close. The flesh and muscles were almost all eaten and picked away, though bite-sized chunks still clung to the bones. Organs that weren't eaten were lying on the road beside the body or still in its belly. The skull barely had any meat left on it, and its eye sockets were clearly gouged by claws. Its gore-coated jaw hung open from the man's final scream, and had enough flesh left on it to hold the jaw to the skull. Setting his rifle down by the body and covering his mouth, Ross first patted down the shredded pants on the body, but the keys were nowhere in the belt or in the pockets. They weren't in either hand either, or lying nearby. Knowing there was every chance one of the dinosaurs had eaten them and ruined the only chance he had, Ross decided to take a chance after spotting part of the man's belt lying in the torn flesh and organs inside the lower stomach of the corpse, and he plunged his hand into the gore. It was still warm, and everything that was human was soft, to the point it made him feel queasy. Ross had dealt with and handled multiple bodies throughout his career, more within the last year than ever after the serial killer became active, but this one was by far the worst. Even the Reaper's most mutilated victim, or rather most melted, since his method of removing forensic evidence was melting the bodies with acid, wasn't as stomach-turning as the one Ross now had his hand inside of. The only upside was that, with everything other than the bones he felt being soft and squishy, the metallic, smooth keys instantly stood out when his hand brushed against them. Keeping a cheer back, Ross grasped each key tightly within his fist to prevent them jingling and pulled the keys out of the corpse, thankful they had indeed ended up inside the body rather than inside one of the dinosaurs' stomachs. Not about to be caught while distracted by standing up and figuring out how to turn on the bike, he moved back closer to the building wall and approached the corner he'd driven around and into his current predicament. His scooter was still lying on the street, engine still idling, but Ross ignored it. Even if all he had to do was stand it up and ride away, the motorcycle would be faster. Plus, it was in the middle of the intersection and in full view of each of the streets that it met. Pressing his body up against the building wall, Ross peeked around the corner, leaning forward just enough for one eye to get a view of the street. He needed to see where the raptors were. The last thing he needed was one of them to wander around the corner while he was trying to start the bike. The first thing he saw was their white teeth gleaming, reflecting the bright yellow light of the late afternoon sun. Able to see the raptors without them bearing down on him, Ross was taken aback by just how massive they were. He also saw the feathers on their tails and arms were the longest, and the plumage coating them across their bodies was thick all over, save for on their snouts, underside, bellies, lower legs. Simply put, the raptors were massive. Seeing them sitting still really let it strike Ross just how big the dromaeosaurs were. They easily were tall enough to look a person right in the eyes, maybe even tall enough to look down at some people. They were standing still, together in a circle, facing inwards towards the center, talking amongst themselves, and Ross was reminded about the leader's variant comments. Slowly, the deputy pulled his head back behind the wall so that he was out of sight of the raptors, though he could make out the words the pack's alpha was saying about him. Ross felt some bile rise in his throat at her words, and his hand went to his pistol instinctively as he slowly backed off towards the bike, listening as she discussed all the horrifying things she was planning to do to him once she finally got her claws into him. Ross turned away and hurried back to the bike as silently as he could. And keeping silent as possible, Ross slowly stood the motorcycle up. It was bulky and heavier than it looked, and he nearly dropped it. Standing and balancing it without it scraping the ground also proved to be much harder than he expected. Then, he slowly set himself down on the seat and retrieved the gore-splattered keys from his pocket, moving them slow so they didn't jingle, which was hard when he had to switch hands. Ross had to fidget and try more than one before he found the one that fit into the ignition. When he did, it slid right into the key slot with an audible snap and a soft jingle of the keys. Looking at the corner with wide eyes, Ross relaxed slightly after a few seconds when no feathered heads appeared around the corner. And as soon as he turned the key, Ross knew that the jig was up, though, because the engine let out a tentative rev as power flowed into it. Though he couldn't see them, the deputy could vividly picture the dinosaurs all snapping their heads around to face his direction. Maybe one or two of them cocking their heads, but most likely staring with hyper-focused eyes. And that mental image, along with the sound of heavy footsteps approaching the corner after a moment, was all he needed to motivate him to turn the key again as the engine had stalled the first time. This time, it roared fully to life and he kicked the bike into gear and sped down the street. A glance over his shoulder told him that his guess had been right, as Ross saw that 4 of the large dinosaurs had sprinted around the corner and were following him at a full sprint, the Alpha leading them. Her eyes bore a murderous glare. To say they were fast would undersell their speed. Each time one of them slammed their feet into the pavement, the preceding stride carried the dinosaur forward, the length of an average human's height easily. They were so fast that they were closing the distance between them. Giving the bike more gas, Ross turned around and sped up, driving further into the city with half the pack right behind him. Almost close enough to bite the axle, if they so wished. Okay. Go! The group's leader shouted, faintly hearing the bike drive away. Tearing the metal door open, causing a loud scrape, he motioned the others out and followed them as they sprinted out and across the street to their trucks. They'd only just reached the 2 vehicles when 3 raptors, which hadn't chased after Ross, suddenly appeared, having hidden themselves out of sight near the trucks to wait for an ambush. Shit! The group's leader shouted as the dromaeosaurs charged out of an alley near the trucks, shrieking at their prey. The leader fired 1 shot from the rifle he was holding, which missed, before diving into the open driver's side door of the lead truck. He stuck the keys into the ignition, and the vehicle roared to life as one of the raptors leapt onto the roof. Stomping on the gas, he pulled the vehicle out onto the street with an excess amount of swerve, throwing the raptor from the roof into the sidewalk. The unbuckled passengers in the vehicle were also thrown into each other. Behind them, the second vehicle also roared to life and sped up to the first. The 3 raptors, the one who was thrown had already jumped back onto its feet, followed right behind them at a full sprint. Meanwhile, Ross still had the Alpha and the 3 others right on his heels, or his rear brakes. They hadn't slowed their pursuit at all and instead seemed to be only pushing themselves to run even faster. Glancing back over his shoulder, he could see the determination in the dinosaur's eyes, especially that of the Raptor Alpha ahead of the pack. Facing forward again, Ross spotted a sign above an approaching intersection and made a sharp turn to the left. He slowed greatly as he did, but he had just enough of a lead on the dinosaurs to make the turn and speed up again before they could catch him, though they were now right behind him, the nearest in snapping distance. Each also gracefully made the turn around the street corner without slowing. Ross didn't sacrifice what little lead he had for no reason, though. He made the turn so he could lead the raptors to a place that he could possibly use against them. Possibly. A few blocks later, Ross emerged from the forest of skyscrapers. He had led the dinosaurs across an overpass, and from there, down and out over a long bridge crossing the Ohio River. The bridge was long, and he wasn't sure which specific one it was, but Ross had a reason for leading the raptors here. Maneuvering the bike over to the side of the bridge, he slowed, just enough to see if he could get one of the raptors to jump at him now that they were nearly on top of him. The 2 closest ones took the bait and leapt at him, jaws gaping and reaching out with their claws. Ross sped up again, and the 2 raptors flew behind him, sailing right over the guardrail and falling, shrieking down into the river below, with a combined splash so loud he could hear it over the roaring engine of his bike. Ross gasped from the strain of keeping his cool, but he steadied himself, a result of years of having to keep his cool under pressure, and he unslung the shotgun from his back. The 2 remaining raptors were easily keeping pace with the motorcycle, and as the nearest raptor put on a new burst of speed and began to close the distance between them, jaws opening to snap at him, Ross again took his eyes off the road and stuffed the gun barrel down the raptor's throat. The dinosaur's eyes bulged, and it bit down on instinct, while a gurgled growl of surprise emitted from its throat as Ross pulled the trigger. The back of the dinosaur's head disintegrated as the bullet passed through its skull. Bits of bone, feathers, brain matter, and even one of its eyes flying out into the air behind it. As its head was blown apart, the raptor's legs gave out and it tumbled to the ground and rolled over itself into a tangled mess of limbs. Unfortunately, though it wasn't expected, the dinosaur's jaws were still clamped on the rifle barrel and it was ripped from Ross's grip. Now, only armed with his service pistol, Ross grasped its grip to ensure that it was still firmly in its holster. As he did, he spared another moment to look at the remaining raptor, the Alpha, and saw that she was finally beginning to slow down. Her sides were heaving with each breath, though now she looked more enraged than ever. Satisfied, Ross turned to face forward again and put more gas into the engine, putting more distance between himself and his pursuer. He realized that the comparison to cheetahs was correct. They couldn't sprint at a full speed forever. Ross knew that if he could outrun the dinosaur, or at least run it to exhaustion, he'd be able to take her out as well. He further increased his speed, and the raptor did the same, keeping close behind him despite her growing exhaustion. Ross finished crossing the bridge and drove at the fastest speed he was willing to risk, back into the forest of empty skyscrapers. The Achillobator Alpha was right behind him the whole time, putting in so much speed to her legs that they were becoming a blur, and keeping so close behind him that she could taste the exhaust from the bike. The look in her eyes had only grown more manic. They looked like an unhinged version of the cold eyes Ross had seen in the serial killer he and Vincenzo had been trying to catch. Those weren't the eyes of a carnivorous dinosaur on the hunt. Those were the eyes of something which killed for enjoyment, Ross realized. The two trucks swerved down the road, dodging abandoned and wrecked cars or other vehicles. Despite the obstacles and constant swerving, they were able to drive fast enough to keep ahead of the three raptors chasing them. Sitting in the driver's seat of the second truck was the blonde woman. Sitting in the passenger seat next to her was the young man, and in the back behind them was the smaller Latino man. He was digging through the bag of guns Ross had been carrying, saying, "Let's see what guns the cop had." As he opened it, he was pleasantly surprised. "Shit, this guy was packing the real stuff," he excitedly called out, pulling out a powerful pump-action shotgun from the bag and loading several shells into it. The young man took his eyes off the raptors in the mirror and looked back. "Oh, that stuff is way better than most of what we have at camp," he agreed. With the pump-action shotgun loaded, the man in the back turned around, slid open the back window, and leaned outside. Pumping once to make sure the gun was ready to fire, he leveled it at the nearest Achillobator. Despite the awkward arrangement, and even with the truck swerving, he managed to aim straight and fired at the dinosaur. The spread that fired from the barrel shredded the dinosaur's face and neck apart, and it dropped to the pavement instantly, rolling over its own limp limbs. The Achillobator sprinting behind it jumped over the corpse with a chittering squawk, flapping its feather-covered arms like wings for a moment, and then it landed mid-stride and continued sprinting after the truck. Its fangs bared into a snarl, and it bore a murderous glare in its intelligent eyes. The third Achillobator also jumped over the corpse mid-stride and kept the chase up without slowing down, its feet slamming onto the pavement in blurred flashes. "Prehistory? Meet the pump action," the man said, pointing the gun up and pumping it again. "You're not ready for this." He again lowered it and fired at the nearest Achillobator, but he didn't see the almost smile on its lips as he aimed. As soon as he squeezed the trigger and fired, the nearest of the two raptors ducked underneath the shot and sprung forward from the squatting position with a powerful jump, doing so with such efficiency and speed that it didn't lose any ground. It landed on the closed tailgate of the truck and dangled off the back of the vehicle for a moment. Within seconds, it scrambled up into the back of the pickup's bed. With a shriek, it latched its jaws onto the shotgun's barrel before the man could fire again. He'd been so surprised by the dinosaur dodging the shot that he hadn't even snapped out of his brief shot long enough to pump the gun up again. The dinosaur tore the gun from the man's grasp with a powerful yank, and it nearly pulled him completely out of the back window and into the bed with it as it did. With the man laying at its feet, the raptor tossed the gun off to the side and looked down at him with a smile so wicked that it didn't have any business being on such a scary, inhuman face. It tapped its curved sickle claw on the metal bed in a taunting manner. The man gulped. "You're scary smart," he whimpered as he met eyes with the dinosaur. It began to lean down towards him, its jaws just slightly parted, like it was going to kiss him. Meanwhile, in the passenger seat, the young man saw the whole thing play out. It happened so fast that at first he froze, before he shouted to the blonde woman, "Swerve! Now!" By a stroke of good luck, at that moment they were speeding towards an intersection. So, she cut the wheel hard to the right. As the other truck continued forward, the second, with a slight spin, turned onto the new street. The momentum threw the Achillobator off balance and it went flying out of the back of the truck. The man which it had been about to maul managed to hang on and stayed anchored in the bed of the truck. He gasped once the truck straightened out and sighed in relief. He pushed himself back through the window and into the back seat. "Thanks," he said, visibly shook. The driver nodded to him in the rearview mirror, and the young man looked in the mirror outside his window. "One followed the other truck, and that one that was in the back is on its feet and following us again," he reported. "I'm over these freaks," the driver muttered, looking in the mirror on her side. She began to speed the truck up and watched as the Raptor began sprinting even faster to maintain its close pursuit. "What are you doing?" the young man asked. The woman held up her finger. "I got this," she said. "Put your seatbelts on, you two, or you are going to go flying." Looking alarmed, the two passengers quickly put their belts on and braced for whatever was coming. Continuing to bait the pursuing Raptor, the woman slowly kept increasing the speed of the truck, staying in the middle of the street to avoid crashing into any of the wrecked cars or streetlights that dotted the sides. Come on, she silently urged. As the dinosaur put all its effort into the pursuit, the driver suddenly slammed on the brakes as hard as she could. The truck skidded to a stop nearly instantly, leaving burnt tire marks on the pavement, and everyone was thrown forward by the momentum until their seatbelts locked to hold them in place. The Raptor squawked, but it was sprinting so fast, and was so close, that it couldn't stop in time. It skidded forward despite trying to slow itself, and then tumbled forward and slammed snout first into the tailgate at nearly the speed it had been sprinting at. It hit easily hard enough to crack the bones in its snout. As it tumbled down into a heap on the pavement, the driver put the truck in reverse and pressed on the gas as hard as she could. Creating smoke for a moment, the truck rocketed backwards and right over the Raptor. There was another squawk, then the sound of bones and muscle being crushed, and several thumps as the vehicle drove over the dinosaur. She then put the vehicle in drive and did the same thing again, driving forward over the dinosaur's corpse for a second time to make sure it was dead. "Prehistory? Meet the pickup," she said, looking at the two passengers with a smirk. He definitely wasn't ready for that. The young man looked like he'd seen his life flash before his eyes, but he nodded. So did the man in the back, still shaking from his close encounter with the dinosaur. The woman then pressed the pedal again and started driving forward, leaving the crushed body behind on the road. She took the first left they came to and started trying to loop around to find the others and help them with their pursuer if they needed it. The other truck, which contained the rest of the group, had not lost its pursuer yet. The pursuing Achillobator was relentless, putting all of its energy into maintaining its speed, pushing its body to its absolute limit. It was beginning to close the distance between them, its feet hitting the pavement so loud that it was audible through the closed windows, its large sickle claws a flashing blur each time it stepped. The leader was looking in his mirror as he drove through a three-way intersection when suddenly he saw another blurred shape come into view from the side and slam into the dinosaur. With a shriek, it was sent flying and it sailed into the large windows of a store, crashing through and vanishing inside the building. He slammed down the brake pedal and looked out of the back window to see what had happened. It was the second truck, its bumper a bashed-in tangle of metal. The other driver had slammed their vehicle into the Raptor as it passed through the intersection. The leader saw her give him the thumbs up. Nodding, he let off the brake and continued driving, the second truck following, and they sped away before the Raptor could recover from the impact and chase them again. The young man heard the smaller Latino man sigh in the back seat. "You okay?" he asked, concern on his face. The man nodded. "Yeah, I just never thought I'd get chased by something worse than a bull. Got too close to one while visiting my cousin's ranch once. Until today, that was the scariest thing I've ever gone through, but that animal had nothing on the raptor, especially the raptor's teeth." "You didn't get bit, right?" the young man asked. "No, I didn't. And I was about a second away from kissing the bride," the man replied, with a small laugh as he began to relax. The young man and blonde woman both laughed too, now able to since the situation was over and they'd finally escaped. "You would have made a lovely couple," she teased. "Yeah, I can't wait to see the kids," the young man added. The man in the back shuddered a little bit. "Ugh, thanks for that mental image," he said. "What, you didn't sense the spark?" the driver asked. The man in the back shook his head. "Too many claws, and too much of a threat of immediate death for my taste," he said, looking drained by the whole experience. Glancing back, Ross saw the Alpha Raptor still behind him, chasing him with the relentless determination of a heat-seeking missile that was armed with teeth and claws. She was breathing heavily, but not breaking her gaze even so much as to blink. Her entire focus was on catching up to him, but she could only push her body to keep her top sprinting speed up for so long. She did begin to fall behind, and then she fell further back. Ross let out the breath he hadn't been intending to hold in and turned the bike off the street he'd been driving on, and found that he had turned onto a dead-end street. He stopped, ahead only seeing a blank brick wall, the same on each side of him, and the only things in front of him was a dumpster and some empty cars. Ross slowly turned around to face the Alpha as he heard her heavy footsteps come around the corner and into the alley. She stood at the end of it, blocking his only way out. She ruffled her feathers and shook her head, the feathers on her neck raised like a wolf would raise its hackles. Her eyes locked onto his own, with a snarl spread across her snout, exposing each gleaming tooth she had inside her jaws. She wasn't, but it looked like she was smiling. The raptor was breathing hard, and foamy saliva was falling out of her jaws with each exhale. Ross turned the bike around to face her as she flexed her claws and took a step towards him. "You're mine," she hissed, sadism dripping from her voice just as thickly as the saliva dripping from her jaws was. She approached with heavy footsteps, claws tapping on the asphalt with each footfall, claws flexing in aggression, and feathers raised in a threatening manner. Ross began edging back towards the wall at the end of the street, keeping the distance between them the same. His hand went to his service weapon, and, while keeping an eye on the dinosaur out of the corner of his eye, not able to take his gaze off her, he ejected the clip to check how many bullets were left in the pistol. There were none in the clip, but he knew he hadn't fired them all either. "Let's see. I have one bullet left," he said, sliding the clip back into the gun and flicking off the safety. Still straddling the idling bike, he turned his gaze back towards the raptor, which was still slowly walking towards him. With each step, her sickle claw lightly clicked on the asphalt, like the calling card of a serial killer. They stared at each other, into the eyes of one another, their eyes at the same height above the ground. For just a moment they were on equal footing. Ross had never seen a pair of eyes filled with so much sadism and rage that it was practically luminous within them. None of the other dinosaurs he had seen earlier that day had a sparkle in them remotely like it. It wasn't just the intelligence the raptor had. Before then, Ross had only seen that look in the eyes of some of the evilest humans he'd ever encountered on his job. Not even the most aggressive animals he'd ever encountered had eyes gleaming like the raptors were. She continued to slowly creep closer to him, feathers still raised aggressively like hackles, her sickle claw flexing with each step, before she bolted and slipped out of his sight behind one of the abandoned cars. Ross raised his pistol and backed the bike up more, keeping it between him and her until he found himself against the wall at the end of the street. There were no doors to open, or fences to climb over, or fire escapes to scale. The walls around him were solid concrete, and the only way back out was ahead, past the raptor that he knew probably still had her eyes on him. Unlike the one he'd encountered on the road, this time he could not see her. He knew he could chance it and try to drive back out, gunning the engine as hard as he could, but she had ducked behind a car he'd have to maneuver around, placing herself in such a spot that she could keep his only way out blocked. If he tried to drive out, she'd lunge on him, and it would be over. Some of our talking kin might have befriended some of your kind, but that's not how the world should work. This is how it should work, human. The predator hunts and feeds on the weaker animal, the prey. Ross heard a tapping sound, the dinosaur's hand claws tapping against the side of the car door as she crouched out of sight behind the vehicle. To us, your kind are the weak animals, she added. That's what the voice in my head tells me you are. You blindly follow that inner voice, huh? Ross asked. What is that? Your primitive instincts speaking up? Or your true feelings? It's my own voice speaking, so I know it's one I can trust. Yeah, and saying you'll make me watch while you do all of these horrific things to me? Is that the way the natural world is supposed to go? Yeah, I heard that part. I don't think most carnivores do that when hunting. How about you explain that? The deputy said. Ross swore he could sense a sneer spreading out on the Chillabator's face. Might as well have some fun with being the superior creature, if you're able to appreciate being such a thing when you know you are, she replied, still crouched out of sight behind the vehicle, not even a single stray feather sticking out. Also, I think you've got a grudge against me because I shot one of your pack fellows. Is that how it's supposed to work? Is it not that the superior individual taking down the inferior one? If that's how you see everything, then I'd figure you'd appreciate me weeding out the weaker ones of your pack the way I did. Ross spat, and the raptor suddenly darted out from behind the vehicle she'd been hiding behind in a flash of blurred feathers, and she hid behind a dumpster he was right next to. You know, you're smart. We're smart. You're imaginative as we are. If we actually work together, maybe we could make this world a good place for everyone instead of whatever it is you're playing. Don't deny it. There's plenty of your kind out there who are just like me, she replied. The ones who know their place compared to others and don't shy away from making that status known. Yeah. And you're reminding me of one of them. A serial killer I was trying to catch before all this happened. We don't take kindly to those kinds of people in our society, and I don't take kindly to being threatened by you. Being hunted by a hungry animal is one thing, but that's not what you are. You're just like him, the one I was trying to catch. And yet, you couldn't catch him. So, who really is the inferior one between us both? Human, she hissed, spitting the last word out in a clear message of disdain for what she saw as the weaker animal that didn't deserve to coexist in the same world as her species. Yeah, I didn't catch him, but I tried. That's what I do. I protect and serve others, and right now, you are what I need to protect others from. Ross said, with the raptor still out of sight, but just on the other side of the dumpster he was next to. Ross pulled the hammer on the pistol back. 1 bullet, he whispered under his breath. He had 1 bullet, so he had to make his 1 chance count. Grasping the gun tightly, he then spoke louder. You might be a threat, but you also care about your pack. I saw how angry you got after I killed the first one. I'll give you a one-time chance, right here and now, just between us. Walk out of this alley now and go away, and we all walk out of here. You can find the rest of your pack that flew off that bridge and live. Everyone goes their own way, and no one else dies. I never liked using a gun on a person, and I don't want to use it on any more of you, because I see you're as complex as any person. But if you don't take this offer, I will use it. Ross allowed the raptor a moment to consider his words before he spoke again. So, how about it? Do you want to live and have a second chance? Or do you die in this dead-end alley? Only you and me would ever know if you accept. The raptor didn't answer. The only sound was her claws ticking on the ground as she crouched lower to the ground, maybe for a spring. So Ross pressed his lips into a grim line and shook his head before placing his bait. Fine. Guess I can't change your mind. And you're between me and my only way out. And I don't think 1 bullet from this little pistol is enough to take you down. You know what? Since it's clear I won't change your mind, I think I'll use this 1 bullet on myself and not give you the satisfaction of killing me. Enjoy eating a corpse you can't torture first. Ross then pointed his pistol upward and placed his hand on the trigger. His training from the police academy came back to him. Bring the pistol up to your eye and only pull the trigger when you have to, and when you know the discharge will strike the target, his old trainer had said. So he waited. I'm not about to let another Reaper stay loose on the world, Ross thought as he aimed the gun. He couldn't catch 1 killer, but this one would not get away. Upon hearing his words, they prompted the dinosaur to action. The exhausted raptor crouched all the way down and sprung, not about to be robbed of the satisfaction of dragging this man's fate out after such a long chase and costly day. With a shriek, she flew over the dumpster, arms extended and jaws agape. The attack was sloppy and rushed, in total contrast to the cold and efficient hunter the group had first encountered. And as she sailed over the dumpster, she flew right into Ross's sight and the sight at the end of his pistol. He fired his single bullet. It sailed through the air and up into the raptor's upper jaw, and continued through the bone and up into her brain. She tumbled down onto the asphalt with a heavy flop and lay dead, sprawled in a heap of extended limbs, with blood dripping from her open mouth and onto the ground. Ross sighed as the tension in his muscles drained away, and he lowered his arms. He regarded the body, now a mere shell with no life in it, though it was still warm from the life that had flowed in it just seconds before. He shook his head. What a waste, he muttered. It's too bad that group, my group, and your pack probably could have done some good things together if you weren't like this. Especially if that comment about some of you guys befriending people is true. I'm sorry this had to happen. You probably loved your pack as much as that group loves each other. No one won here. He didn't know if he was talking to himself, or to the Alpha, or to the universe. But either way, he viewed everything that had happened as a tragedy. So many were dead, human and intelligent dinosaur alike, when maybe if things had gone a little differently, none would have died. It was also a tragedy that such an intelligent and beautiful-looking creature had to die because of what happened between the group and its pack. He hoped that the good ones on both sides, from both kinds, would be able to come together in the future and end situations like what had just occurred. The world might have been in ashes at that time, but Ross didn't believe it would stay a crumbled mess forever. He hoped one day the good ones everywhere would come together and fix it. If they could come together, they had a chance to finally fix what had been broken for so long. The road to it, though, he knew, would no doubt... The road to it, though, he knew, would no doubt be more of the same ugliness that had happened today. If that was the case, then Ross was determined to make sure he protected the good ones for as long as it took for that ugliness to pass. A cawing made him look up. A crow was perched on one of the walls, looking down at him. It called out again, before fluttering its wings and flying away. It called a few more times, and the echo quickly faded. Then it was gone. With the danger over, Ross holstered his pistol and strapped it back into place. He then shimmied the idling motorcycle forward, around the dead raptor, whose bright red blood and brain matter was dripping out of her mouth, and back out to the street, where he revved the engine and drove back the way he'd come at full speed. While again crossing the bridge, he stopped to retrieve the rifle he'd lost. He slung it back over his shoulder and then kept driving. Glancing down at the river below for a moment, he didn't see the other two achillobators which had fallen over the side, but he wasn't surprised. He had no doubt they could survive the fall, and figured they'd made it back to one of the banks by then. On each shore were several abandoned barges and pleasure boats, so there were several objects blocking his view of each shoreline, and likely of the raptors too. He sped the bike up and didn't slow down, wanting to put as much distance between him and the other two raptors, wherever they ended up, as possible. He drove back through the city and past the same building the group had been hiding in when he found them. He drove past the idling scooter, and then turned in the direction the trucks had been facing to try and track the others down. He eventually drove through and out of the heart of the forest of skyscrapers and back into the outskirts of the city, to an area filled with smaller buildings, overpasses, and line after line of train tracks. It was only a few minutes after that when he found the others parked on an overpass leading out of the city, waiting for him. The young man, who had been sitting in the bed of the second truck, laughed and gave the deputy a standing ovation when he parked next to the trucks and turned off the bike. "I knew you'd figure it out," he greeted. Ross managed a small smile despite his exhaustion. "I'm surprised you waited," he admitted. "I talked them into waiting for an hour. You are too cool of a dude to leave behind," the young man replied, jumping out of the bed as the leader stepped out of the first truck's driver's side door. "Someone willing to ride off into the sunset with the chillibators on their tail and then come back again with his head still attached is worth keeping around," the young man continued as the group's leader approached the two. "All right, the good officer is here. Let's move. The sun is getting very low," he said. Behind them, the city was being cast into a golden glare with an ever-increasing amount of shadows growing between the skyscrapers. Looking at it for a moment, the leader then nodded to Ross. "Good job. You earned a place with us today." As he spoke, the others also climbed out and came around to where the three were talking. Ross nodded. "Can I have everyone's names, then?" he asked. The young man chortled in amusement, and he held out his hand to Ross. "I'm Eric," he said, shaking Ross's hand. Despite having only met a little over an hour earlier by holding Ross at gunpoint, he was now acting very friendly to him. Eric looked at the rest of the group. "The big man over there is Ronaldo," he said, and the big Latino man nodded curtly, and there was a trace of a smile on his face now. "And his friend is Diego," Eric added, and the smaller man, who had been the one to nearly kiss the achillobator, raised a hand and waved. Eric then motioned to the blonde woman. "That's Lori Harrison," she interrupted, stepping forward and gripping Ross's hand in a firm shake. "You did good. Thank you." Ross nodded, and then looked over her shoulder at the blonde man, who hadn't said a word to him, and who was still sneering a tiny bit. What about him? He asked. The leader spoke up. That's Andrew. And I'm Juan, he said. Okay, meet and greet is over. Let's go.